Wait, do not adjust your set. Do not adjust your set. I have taken over Brendon's show today because what better April Fool could you possibly find than the most foolish of all researchers on the Great Lakes, Ric Mixter, to take over Brendon's show today as we tackle the Griffon, which again, the perfect, absolutely perfect topic to have on April Fool's Day, because there's been I would say no shortage over 300 years of people being fooled by Le Griffon. And that goes from LaSalle himself to all the people who tried to search for him then into the 1930s, which I've got to believe in all of our shipwrecks, there's three big ones that we really always talk about, especially as we talk in Wisconsin. It's Edmund Fitzgerald, Le Griffon, and of course the Christmas tree ship. But the Griffon is the one that I think has had more headlines because it's had 300 years of time to research it. And really, for a lot of journalists, they've gotten it wrong. And that goes from the Toronto papers right to the modern times. The Griffon has been featured on television stations all through Michigan as being found when it wasn't. And to me, it's just a great topic. But I thought, I got to take over this show, and I've got to pull in an expert. And I thought, what a perfect opportunity now to kind of turn the tables and actually bring in who I think, and again, I'm biased, but to bring in the guy I think that knows the most about Le Griffon. And that's because he's actually gotten LaSalle's notes and translated them, reading the actual French instead of just picking up, like most of us, Marjorie and offhand stuff. So I want to bring in a very special friend of mine. And for a lot of you, you've only seen him as the host of this show for 2 years. But Brendon Baillod has been a close friend of mine since 2000. I can't imagine starting any kind of a project without him. And today I want to do kind of This Is Your Life, Brendon Baillod on April Fool's Day. So please welcome our very special guest today, Brendon. Welcome, sir.
Thanks, Rick. Thanks for having me.
I'm thrilled to be here. I cannot believe that we haven't spent more time talking to you. I mean, out of all of the guests you've had, and you've had amazing guests, a lineup of 27 different shows, and it's been a great string, but I don't think we've really gotten to know early stuff. I mean, certainly the partnerships that you've had with so many of the guests, I think, is important, but I'd like to kind of dig back, if we could, and talk a little bit more about the Yooper Kid, especially going back. I mean, you get to grow up in one of the most historic parts of Michigan, especially when you think of the maritime, the copper country for our area, to be able to literally play in the grounds where these mines were, right from Native Americans to, the huge effort to pull it out of the mines and actually turn it into ingots and ship it onto the boat. So can you start and tell us a little bit about Brendon? That's perfect. Carry it from here. Tell me about your days.
I will, Rick. Give me just a second to get us down and the video up. First of all, Rick, thanks so much for doing this, man. I really appreciate it.
It is my pleasure.
So, I was born at a very young age. No. I actually was born here in Madison, Wisconsin, but my dad was in grad school here finishing up his PhD, and he got a job at Michigan Tech teaching civil and environmental engineering. And so when I was 2, I came up to the Copper Country. So it's really the only place I ever remember is growing up in the Copper Country. And this is me on the bow of my dad's Carver Monterey, the Archangel, probably 1973. Those are my brothers and my cousin. And we were about to go out on the boat, probably to Isle Royal. We used to go out there frequently. And so I grew up not just on the waterway, but around a lot of history and a lot of shipwrecks. In particular, we had a number of shipwrecks right there in the waterway. And when I got to be a teenager, I used to like to clean the lures off of them. I got free fishing lures that way. And, I'd go and snorkel them and come home with a bucket full of Rapalas, that are $5 a piece. So, I never knew what they were. And when I got older, I started to research them and try to figure out what they were. And I knew they had a story, and it turned out that some of them were really quite old. It wasn't really until I found Fred Stonehouse's book, Keweenaw Shipwrecks, that I started to get some insight into the historical importance of the copper country in the Great Lakes maritime trade. And I started to learn a lot more about how to do maritime history research because of Fred's excellent bibliography and footnotes. And I started to look up his sources. So I discovered that, one of the shipwrecks I'd been on was actually one of the oldest ships on Lake Superior. I'd been cleaning off an old schooner haul off of the Michigan Tech power plant. It turned out it was the schooner Mediator that had wrecked there in 1898 at the Gratiot River mouth and had been towed into the waterway to be refitted, and then they abandoned it there. And it had been built in 1848 in Canada as the schooner Sinbad. It had a hell of a story, and I was hooked after that. Very early on, I met two important colleagues, Randy Beebe and Dan Fountain, both up there in the UP at the time, who became really important to my early sort of interest. We dove a lot of those wrecks together. And Dan in particular taught me a lot about side scan sonar. He had this old thing he called the Dan scan, which was two old Vexilar papergraphs. And he had the fish, he had the transducers mounted on a fish. And I mean, they'd sort of show stuff off to the side, and I couldn't believe that. And of course, Randy was also a really good researcher, a bit ahead of me in many ways. And so those guys really helped me out to get interested. And I started to go wreck hunting with them. We used to borrow Jerry Eliasson's old Mark I sonar and see what we could find. And I started researching, and I built my own database of Keweenaw shipwrecks. I also got involved in the Keweenaw Underwater Preserve, which at that time was a pretty new thing. There were wrecks, mostly people knew about the ones up on the Lake Superior, but I started to research the ones that were in the waterway, and I built a complete database of all the undiscovered wrecks up there. And for those of you who are interested, this is online, so you can access this. Undiscovered Keweenaw wrecks. Some of these, of course, I since found out weren't lost at all. The schooner Shipwreck, the first schooner up there, was actually recovered. And we find this as we do more research, right? Like that came out of the Mackinac manifests that were all found in Sault Ste. Marie and have since been digitized by the AGLMH. It turns out she was sailed for many more years. But a lot of these wrecks are still there and still undiscovered. And so I still go up there. It's my home. My folks still live up there, and played a big part of my life. So I spent a lot of time in the Keweenaw, looking around there and, diving. This is my brother, Brian, and I. When we were young, on the back of my dad's boat, we just were about to go down on the Uarda for the first time. The big iron-hulled steamer there, built by David Bell in 1891. She burned and sank there, and she's still intact with her triple expansion steam engine on her.
Wow.
So, yeah. I spent a lot of time up there in the Keweenaw, and I still love diving up there. In fact, if we have time, maybe we'll talk about our expedition.
I would like to. Now, did you go to school up there too? I thought you went to school where your dad was actually dean, wasn't he?
He was. I actually graduated from Calumet High School, class of '85, and I went to Michigan Tech because that's what one does when one's dad is a professor, and you live up there. And I spent 3 different years with 4 different majors. There were 4,000 guys and 26 girls on campus. And it was a long, difficult time because everyone up there had an IQ, of 130 or above, and mine was probably just about 10 points below that. So it was a long haul. One time I talked to a girl the whole time I was at Michigan Tech. I was in algebra class, and she was looking at me and smiling, and I didn't know why. I said, well, I better go talk to her. If a girl looks at you and smiles at Michigan Tech, you better seize the opportunity.
You got to get married, yeah.
So I go up to her and I say, hi, how'd you do on the exam? And she looks at me with this quizzical look and says, you've got a big piece of egg in your beard. So that was it. I transferred out of there. I left and I went to Milwaukee.
That guy looks familiar. Is that Herm himself?
That is.
Wow.
That is old man Rungey.
That's amazing. Did you get to work with that collection?
I did. So when I left the Upper Peninsula, it was kind of decided that I was going to move to the big city and get on with my life, and I was going to go to UW Milwaukee. Now, I chose to go and get a psychology degree at UW Milwaukee because, unlike Michigan Tech, where there were 4,000 guys to 26 women, there were about 50 women to every one guy in the psych program at UW Milwaukee. And they were all rich, young, idealistic, liberal girls looking for a bad boy to rehabilitate. And it consequently only took me 13 years to get my degrees there, but it was a fun 13 years. UW Milwaukee is the home of the American Geographical Society map collection. I became a regular gadfly and hanger-on there. But one of the biggest things that I did there is I joined the Wisconsin Marine Historical Society, and I started working for them. So this guy on the screen, Hermann Rungey, he was a railroad man. He was responsible for keeping the statistics for the Milwaukee Road. And he, at a very early age, he was born about 1875, and right around 1900, he started collecting data on Great Lakes vessels. And he got all of the early registers, all the early merchant vessels, the Inland Lloyds, the Greens, the Shipmasters, you name it, he had it all. And he would travel around the lakes to customs houses, getting customs house data. And he made a data card for every vessel on the lakes. And he kept those cards updated every year until his death in 1958.
Wow.
By the time he was done, that card file had about 50,000 cards in it. And I was hired to transcribe those cards into a database. Kim Stabelfeld, one of our previous guests, had set up the database in a program called Alpha 4. And I went through, and we just take one card after another. And I did this for about a year. And I transcribed, I would say, 25, 30,000 of those cards. And by doing that, it did a couple of things for me. I was a young man, but I developed an encyclopedic knowledge of Great Lakes vessels by doing that. I learned how to properly spell every port on the lakes. I learned the name of every shipbuilder on the lakes, because when you go through and you see that much data and you have to write it down, it jets it into your brain. I came out of that with a really encyclopedic knowledge of Great Lakes vessels and ships. It was a really important experience for me. I later joined the Wisconsin Marine Historical Society board. I used to write a lot for Soundings, their newsletter. And it was a good experience, although I did eventually have a falling out with the WMHS many years ago. Kind of water under the bridge now. But I eventually met some guys who had become very important to me, Kim and Brad and Bob. And not shown here is Tim Reed, who was one of our founders of the Great Lakes Shipwreck Research Foundation. And I think everyone here has been on the show except for Brad. He's kind of hasn't been very involved in maritime history, but Kim certainly is, and Bob is. We started the Ghost Ships Festival in 1999, and that was a really fun and important experience because I got to meet people from all over the Great Lakes. I was responsible for getting the speakers because I knew so many people, although Kim did too. And this all kind of started at Bob Jake's house. We knew that Jerry Geyer used to have a shipwreck festival in the high school at Milwaukee, and it had kind of gone by the wayside. And Bob started having a small shipwreck video thing at his house around about 1996. And we thought, why don't we restart this thing? And we did, and it got big. Eventually, this grew into such a big show that, it kind of crushed under its own weight due to the hotels thought we were making a lot more money than we were. We were a nonprofit. And so we would give all the money away in grants, and then we wouldn't have a lot of money for the next year's show. And finally, it just got too expensive. We finally stopped doing it because of the costs of having it at big hotels. But I did start doing research on Lake Michigan shipwrecks, like I had on the Keweenaw. And I eventually amassed a huge database of every ship lost in Wisconsin waters, kind of similar to what I had done up in the Keweenaw. And I wrote that up as a book, Fathoms Deep But Not Forgotten, Wisconsin's Lost Ships, which you see here. I did it for the WUAA. I didn't make any money on it. I donated all the proceeds to the Wisconsin Underwater Archaeology Association. It's a big book. It has, I think, about 400 shipwrecks in it, and every ship ever built at Milwaukee, Racine, Kenosha, or Port Washington. Complete history of them. Book's out of print, unfortunately. So you can get it, but it costs a lot. We're thinking about reprinting it at some point. But this took me about 2 years to write and about 20 years to research. And if you can get a copy, I highly recommend it. Lastly, I started to do work on the other side of the lake, and I wrote a book called Ghosts of the Oceana Coast, Ships and Shipwrecks of Oceana County, which is the Pentwater, Michigan area. And I chose it because the area had not been researched at all, and there were some really cool and important early wrecks. There was also the Armistice Day storm wrecks. And this is kind of how I got to know you really well, Rick, was by working on this book. Because you were working on your documentary, Deep Six, at the time, if I remember. So I think we've lost Rick. He will be joining again soon. All right, let's pick up where I left off. So one of the other things that I started doing around that time was database development. I had gone back to school for a computer science degree, and I learned how to program. And I started to build databases. The first one I did was for the Wisconsin Marine Historical Society. They had transcribed almost 50,000 Great Lakes vessel enrollments from microfilm. And I went ahead and helped them by hosting this. I coded this, wrote a backend in Java, and hooked it up to a SQL Server backend search engine, and you could search all the Great Lakes vessel enrollments using this. I also did one for David Swayze. I got very involved with David, helping him document Great Lakes shipwrecks, and I donated my whole Lake Michigan shipwreck database to him. And he incorporated it in with his data. So if you see BB as a source in the Swayze database, that's my data. And I basically built a very powerful programmed search engine for him. A lot of this stuff is still up, but it's not running a lot of it right now. The last one I did was for Chuck Feltner. I did his master abstract enrollment database of about 25,000 really early Great Lakes vessels, which was a good experience. And then lastly, I did one of all the Great Lakes vessel accident lists. So this was a kind of an important thing for me. I again got much more familiar with the data than I had been, and I developed a pretty encyclopedic knowledge of Great Lakes vessel data. So I'm going to go ahead and hide this now. Rick, it looked like we lost you there for a second.
Oh, I don't know why it dipped out. In fact, I was going to ask you a question as you were talking about Ghost Ship, but I'm intrigued by everything that you've been talking about. One thing you didn't bring up, though, is how did you learn how to restore books? I mean, it's such an amazing craft. How have you picked up that trade to be able to fix it? And I want to talk, and I know we will, about that amazing collection over your shoulder as well. There's stuff there I just can't. Most of my libraries don't have what you have.
Sure. Well, you know what happened there is I kind of got hooked on collecting modern shipwreck books because I was doing research and building databases, and pretty soon I had them all. You get 300, 400, 500 Great Lakes shipwreck books that were written after 1940. You kind of got them all, even the real obscure ones. And I started to buy real early stuff then. And, stuff from the 1800s, even stuff from the 1700s and 1600s, like the original stuff from LaSalle about the Griffon. And some of it was really expensive. And the way I found to get the stuff cheap was I'd buy it in shitty condition. I'd buy it with the cover torn off or with the spine detached or, the binding broken. And my mother sells books online, always has, as far as I can remember. Maybe for 30 years she has. And she knew how to restore books because she'd do the same thing. She'd always fix them up cosmetically before she shipped them. And she taught me how to restore these antique books using acid-free archival materials. And I started to do that with all my books. And my books aren't all in wonderful shape. Some of them, I did the best I could, but I learned how to do that with books. I can restore antique photos. I can restore antique maps. I know how to do it, in non-invasive ways. And sort of the number one thing to remember, don't use regular tape of any kind.
Wow.
Period.
There you go. A tip. And secondly, first, hi, Mom. I did see the message, and I'm so glad she's joining us. And thank you for teaching this young man how to do that. And for you, Brendon, for sharing those in examples that you do online. The thing that's really impressed me, not only about your knowledge too, but you used your computer science degree to get into databases and putting stuff on a web that most of us didn't know, having our own website. You had Baillod.com, like right away with your own, email address and everything. So you were way on the forefront to getting this stuff out. And that helped you too, because not only did you have this knowledge from the Rungey collection and from everything you've been doing, but putting it online, but now people were able to see it and start to pick up on your knowledge. And then you started getting picked for documentaries, right? That's about where you started to get noticed, if you will.
That's right. So, and of course, there were other people that were doing it too. Walter Lewis, and he stuck with it more than me. In fact, I've moved a lot of my data has ended up on Walter's site. And also Bill Lafferty, he also is very computer literate and very similar to me in terms of his focus and his attention to detail and his research ability. So is Walter. Those are my two favorite peers who I really look up to. But yes, I was able to host a lot of data, and it taught me a lot about what's important when you're telling a ship's story. Because the whole purpose of putting this data together isn't so you can go down a rabbit hole and spin the propeller on top of your hat. It's to tell, meaningful stories that connect with people and make them care about maritime history. And so I was able to develop a good sense for what's important and what do people connect to when you are telling a story.
And literally, documentaries started calling. I mean, what a great way to connect. Books are amazing, but the TV reach to people, especially people who haven't been, even into shipwrecks. They see a shipwreck on the TV and instantly they want to know more. And you've been in some really big ones.
Yeah, there've been 4 of them. Well, I'll tell you the truth, though. I used to appear in Mark Gumbinger's Southport video.
Oh, nice.
And Mark, he's a great guy. I miss him. I'm sure he's still around somewhere, But he used to have me drive down to Kenosha, and I didn't know much about him at the time. He had me come down to his house in Kenosha, and he had a studio set up in the basement, And he had me. He took me down there, and he started putting makeup on me, and I was getting a little nervous because I didn't really know this guy. It was just me and him, and he, But he turned out to be a really nice fellow. And I appeared in a number of his Southport video productions, which were really good. I wish they would come out on DVD.
You know who wrote those, don't you? His writer was Schumbacher that did all the, he's done fantastic work on the Fitz, the Bradley, the Morel, the 13th Storm. So there's no question that is a great byproduct. Not to mention Mark. I mean, he is a good guy. I saw him at, I think, one of your first ghost ships.
Yeah, I miss him. If you're out there, Mark, give me a call sometime. But this is the first one that was nationally syndicated. This is Shipwreck Rage of the Great Lakes. It was out of a place in Toronto, produced by a guy named Aiken Scherberger, who was just a nice guy. And he, came all the way to my house in Wisconsin and brought a film crew and interviewed me. And really kind of let me take over in some ways as a co-producer. I hooked him up with all the people he needed to talk to, and we kind of decided together on what ships he should talk about. And of course, the Eastland was a big one. We talked about the Lady Elgin. If I'm not mistaken, we might have even had Harry involved in it. But it was a great documentary and a really good experience for me. And I kind of enjoyed it. This is occasionally aired once in a while. But you can't find it. In fact, I had a hard time finding this. I've got a digital copy of it, but it was an excellent documentary. After that, of course, I was approached by John and Richie of Deep Sea Detectives. They were doing two Great Lakes documentaries. They did one called Trainwreck on Lake Michigan about the car ferry Milwaukee, and then they did one about the Cornelia Windiet, which was found on the wrong lake. She was supposed to have gone down on Lake Michigan, and was found in Lake Huron. And it was interesting experience. I thought that they were good documentary makers, John and Richie. They kind of knew how to keep it going and how to tell a snappy story. And I was particularly impressed with their work on the car ferry Milwaukee, because they actually found some new and interesting information that the Seagate, or not the Seagate, but there were covers over the grates in the stern that were supposed to be sealed, and they weren't. And so I thought that was an excellent documentary. I enjoyed working on that one.
Cool.
And then the big one, and the one that I enjoyed the most, was Ghost Ships of the Great Lakes. And so this was for Nat Geo, and this came about as the result of the discovery of the L.R. Doty off of Milwaukee. And for those of you who remember the L.R. Doty discovery, it was Jerry Geyer had been given numbers to a big snag out in 300 feet of water, going on 25 years ago. And he told me about it, and I just never thought anything of it. And years passed, and I was doing the research for my book, Fathoms Deep, and I found this account from this woman who had survived the wreck of the L.R. Doty. She was on the vessel it was towing, the Olive Jeanette, and the tow line snapped, and she watched the Doty sail off into the storm, never to be seen again.
Wow.
And she was washed all the way down from where the tow line snapped for 3 days, 36 hours. She had lashed herself to the mast. The masts were broken. The deck houses were washed overboard. She was near death from hypothermia when they picked her up and brought her into Chicago. And she told her story. Her name was Frankie Waters. And she said that she had seen the tow line snap when they were just about abreast of Milwaukee. Well, that was new information. We'd always thought the Doty was off Kenosha, because that's what the papers said at the time, back in 1898 when it sank. So I told Jerry, I said, I triangulated. I said, Jerry, that's the L.R. Doty out there. Almost certainly. It's right on the path, right on the track line she would have been on. And it's right where Frankie Waters said the tow line broke. So I told Yitka about it, and I said, Yitka, we should really check that out someday. And she said, well, I'll go out as soon as I get a weather window. And she did. She went out there and was the first person on it. She went out to the numbers, and there it was. Wow. And John Jansen and John Scholes and Tracy Zalowski went down on it, and 300 feet deep. Dangerous wreck. It's already taken 2 lives since then. But what got me about this wreck and about this documentary was that the L.R. Doty, was towing the Olive Jeanette. Well, the Olive Jeanette was no stranger to me. When I was a young man growing up on the Keweenaw, a commercial fisherman named Art Lassinen told me that he had brought up a human skull in his nets off of the Huron Islands. And there's only one shipwreck that I knew that should be out there, it was a woman's skull. And there was only one wreck I knew of that should have a woman's skull on it off of the Huron Islands, and that was the Olive Jeanette. The Olive Jeanette was lost in 1905 in the Great Storm of 1905 with all hands. And the debris came ashore at the Huron Mountain Club, so we know that she was off the Huron Islands. And Art remembered where he had brought up the human skull. And so we went out to the site, and of course, the Olive Jeanette was there. She had actually been discovered in secret earlier by Mark Rowe and Bill Reynolds. But when I went out there, one of the things I realized is that this skull was probably Frankie Waters, probably the woman who gave the account that we used to find the L.R. Doty. So in a way, this young woman, helped us find both the L.R. Doty and the Olive Jeanette.
Wow.
So I pitched that story to National Geographic, and they ate it up with a fork and knife. And, Frankie Waters, what was interesting is it seemed that she was passing herself off as a man on the ship, because it was considered unlucky to have a woman on the ships. And she was going by Frankie Waters, which was interesting to me because she was listed as a man on the Olive Jeanette when she was lost, even though she was listed as a woman in 1898 when she survived. Wow. So that was also an interesting angle that they played. So it was a great documentary. Randy Beebe helped us. He operated. Jerry Geyer helped us. He lent us his Marine Sonic sonar. That's Randy operating Jerry's sonar. That's my dad piloting the boat. And in the doorway is Mark Rowe, one of the discoverers of the Olive Jeanette. And you can see the film crew filming us there. We were outside scanning the Olive Jeanette. So it was a really successful documentary. And we had a great time doing it. The next thing I was on, which was the most recent, which I'd like to say it was the best one, but it was the Expedition Unknown episode with Josh Gates about the Griffon. And they contacted me, and when they did, they were like, well, we heard that you translated LaSalle's letters. And I'm like, yeah, I did. And I have an idea where it is, and I've been looking for it. What they didn't tell me is they were working with a whole separate group over on Lake Huron to a whole second sort of different take on it, which neither here nor there. They can do that if they want. But the thing that made me a little nervous is they contacted me a few weeks before the documentary and said, guess what? We found a submarine. And I'm like, a what? Yeah, we're going to have you go down in a submarine onto, and I'm like, what? And so when Jim Kennard and I had been looking together for the Griffon for years, and we had run over the wreck of the William Holmes some years earlier, and I had pitched to these guys that we should go out and pretend we're wreck hunting, and we'll run over the William Holmes. We'll go, oh, hey, that's a wreck. We should ground truth it. We'll drop the camera. We'll see that it's not the Griffon, and then we'll go on. Well, instead, they said, let's go down to that in the submarine. Well, suffice it to say, the submarine had issues. And it was 40 years old, and its scrubbers weren't working correctly, and the cameraman almost passed out. And I got cold feet. I already brought a couple of Xanax tablets to take them just so I would get enough balls to go down in that thing. And I finally told him, I said, you know what, I'm not gonna. And I talked on a hydrophone from the surface, but in the end, the sub actually had some trouble. It ran into the break wall going into Mackinac and bent the rudder, and it was a real comedy of errors. And I have to say, it was no fault of I don't think it was any fault of the sub owner. He was a pretty competent guy, knew what he was doing, but it was, we had that sub out in pretty rough water at times, and it was just a comedy of errors. I think also we were kind of pushed pretty hard to try to get some footage of something that looked like a shipwreck, but it was not my favorite documentary. I don't know that it kind of soured me on it. I don't know that I'll do TV documentaries.
I hope that's not true.
Well, we'll see. We'll see. It you can still see it occasionally on the Discovery Channel. They interviewed me up on the top of the Shipwreck Point Lighthouse, and that was pretty scary. I was standing out there with a book, leaning over the edge with. One thing I will say about Josh Gates, that guy has balls of steel. He went down in that sub over and over again, despite the fact that it was, hit or miss. Say what you will, but that guy is bold, very much so.
That's incredible. What amazing adventures and smartness. I think that many of us, we take reasonable risks as divers, and we take reasonable risks as, storytellers to do stuff. And, I think when I was a pilot, I was told you go into the hangar and there's a sign that said there's old pilots and there's bold pilots, but there's no old, bold pilots. So that's kind of what keeps us alive, is maybe having that second sense not to go in there.
Yeah, definitely. Let me see what I got up here.
Oh, nice. I did want to talk about this collection because when I look over your shoulder, it looks to me, and again, I'm just guessing, but it looks like you've got the entire Pioneer collection of Michigan, and if I'm seeing the Jesuit, the relations too.
Yeah. So let me give some backstory on this. So, and I'll come up here to do that. Part of what got me started on collecting a lot of the early material was a presentation I did many years ago. I started it in 2005, maybe even in 2000, called Famous Wrecks That Never Happened. And what I realized was that there's so much of what we know about these famous shipwrecks is either gilded heavily or is just flat out fabrication. And I started looking at these treasure maps, these early stories of these treasure ships like, Le Jean Florin and Le Blanc Henri, which are supposed to be on Lake Erie and Lake Ontario. And I found, tracked them to their sources and found out that they were invented by the treasure hunters back in the 1950s and 60s, to sell maps. And I wondered if the Griffon was real, other than maybe, how do we know what we think we know about that ship, right? Because I just assumed it was oral tradition, to be quite frank with you.
Yep.
And that it was just a whole lot of conjecture and BS. Because when you read those books, half of them think it's on Lake Huron, half of them think it's on Lake Michigan. So I came at it with really an open mind, kind of thinking, well, you know what? I bet that most of it's fake. And so I started to do a bibliographic study of it. And I went into Francis Parkman's works. And he was a really eminent, 19th century historian of the fur trade in the early French and British period on the Great Lakes. And he had been corresponding with a fellow named Pierre Margry, who was the curator of the Ministry of Marine and Colonies in Paris. And he developed a fast friendship with Margry. And Margry had made it his life's work to collect all the documents about La Salle. He was obsessed with La Salle. And he had tons of original letters and all sorts of early documents from all the people who were actually on the Griffon. But Margry, he was one of these guys who liked to play his cards close to the breast. He didn't want to tell everybody what he had. He published papers occasionally, but he made a claim that kind of discredited him. He said that he thought that La Salle was the first person to ever discover the Mississippi. That's not true. It was, Marquette and Joliet.
Mm-hmm.
And a lot of people discredited Margry, but the fact remained that he had all this amazing material. And I found a set of Margry's original works from 1869. They were in French, and I had to translate them into English and I had 6 years of French in college, and so I was able to do it. And what I found was that there's a very detailed letter written in 1681, the 2 years after the Griffon was lost, when La Salle had come back to try to go down the Mississippi. Those of you who know the story, he tried the first time, and they were attacked by the Iroquois at Fort Crevecoeur at present-day Peoria, Illinois, and Hennepin was taken up into Minnesota by the Sioux, and Tonty was stabbed by the Iroquois, and had to lay low. And La Salle left and walked on foot across lower Michigan with 2 sick men, dragging them behind him on a sled, eventually getting to Buffalo, the site of Buffalo, New York, which obviously wasn't there then. But and then he came back to try to do this all over again, if you can believe that. And that's when he wrote this letter. And he had sent 2 men to circumnavigate Lake Michigan to learn what became of his bark. And they came back and told him that they had found debris, and they showed it to him, the debris. This is all in La Salle's own words. This isn't, some third person talking about him. It's La Salle saying, and then they came back and showed me this debris. And they said that they had talked to some Indians called Potawatomis who had actually seen the ship at anchor the night before, waiting out a storm. And the captain had left the next day against their advice, and they were blown down obliquely towards some islands in the distance called the Huron Islands, and lost from view. And they were obliged, he said, to strike all but one of their sails, and then they were unable to maintain headway. And it's a lot of detail, a lot of things that they could see. And so I translated this, and I actually found a map drawn by the commandant of Fort Michilimackinac, the Sieur de Livigny. And it actually shows the islands that are today known as the Beaver Islands. On that map, they're called des Îles Huron, the Huron Islands, because the Huron tribe diaspora were hiding out there from the Iroquois. And in the account, La Salle says the ship was blown down towards the Huron Islands.
Wow.
So it kind of fixes the point where they had to have been and where they had to have sheltered. The point that, of land that comes out, it's the only shelter on that whole coast. And there's no, mistaking it, because the French called it point sous choix, only choice point.
Wow.
And so there's a lot of evidence that the Griffon had overnighted there under Shipwreck, and was, they tried to leave to go to Mackinac, and they were instead blown down obliquely towards the Beavers and sank somewhere in there. Now that's all real shallow in there. Not much of it's over 100 feet deep. So I do think the Griffon is somewhere between Shipwreck Point and the Beavers, but I think it's a debris field. And I think it's badly broken up. And if you do look for it, you're going to be looking for cannons and anchors and anvils, not for wooden debris. Maybe a keel and ribs if you're lucky, but it's small. It takes a very narrow search beam, maybe 150 feet per side. You're going to be going slow, 2 miles an hour. You probably should be towing a mag, and it takes forever. So I don't have a lot of high hopes that it's going to be found. It's one of the reasons I don't go looking for it anymore, is because it is a difficult find. Yep. And there's no mystery about where the Griffon probably is. Most real historians agree that she probably is somewhere off of Shipwreck Point, but will she ever be found? I think she can be. I think that if people look for that major ironwork, those anchors and those anvils, she, after all, was carrying all the supplies to build a second bateau down on the Mississippi, to descend the Mississippi. And she was carrying a lot of tools and supplies. So,
yeah, you just have to look at the label and what they found. I mean, obviously they wouldn't have all of that because they were trying to carry furs as well, but label had over 1 million artifacts found on it.
Yeah. Well, so that started me collecting, because I started to collect this early French material, because it's one thing to say, oh, I think the Griffon is off here, just because I look for shipwrecks. It's another to become an expert on New France and to understand the context of the time. A lot of people say, well, LaSalle's men, they deserted him, and LaSalle said, in a later account that his men that had come across this Indian boy who said that he had seen Europeans, and one of them had a grenade and he exploded it. And so they've said that had to have been the crew from the Griffon, that they had survived. Well, this was way up on the Mississippi, right? Most historians today believe that was Daniel Duluth, Sieur Duluth, who rescued Hennepin. Mm-hmm. They were there at the time, not that it was, the crew of the Griffon. If you read and you understand the history of New France, you know that there was really two sides. There were the Algonquin-speaking tribes that were allied with the French, and there were the Iroquois nation that were allied with the British, and the two were really waging a proxy war. The Indians, the natives on Lake Michigan, were all Algonquin peoples, and particularly the ones that lived up there were Potawatomi and Ho-Chunk and Menominee, and they were friendly towards the French, very much so, and they would not have tried to bring harm to LaSalle or the Griffon. They viewed LaSalle as an ally.
Yeah.
And the other theory that the Frenchmen, absconded with the ship and wrecked it also doesn't really hold water, because there were less than 2,000 Frenchmen in New France. Every one of them, their whereabouts was known. They all did business at the pleasure of the intendant and the king. For any one of them to come back with LaSalle's, it was all known that they were with LaSalle, and one of them comes back suddenly rich, they'd be hanged. Mm-hmm. So it wasn't like they could do this sort of desertion where they, take the money and run, right? They might take off and try to disappear into the wilderness, but, the odds of the Griffon having been hijacked by LaSalle's own men pretty slim. So I started to collect all these early accounts, right? And I ended up finally collecting the actual original accounts. I own the original 1683 description of Louisiana in French by Hennepin. I also own his 1698 New Discovery of a Vast Country in America. I own the original accounts of Henri de Tonty, and the original accounts of Father Mombre, who was also one of the Recollet Franciscan friars that accompanied them. And so I've read all these and synthesized all that information. And that's why I think I have a more than a wreck hunter's guess about where the Griffon is. But the collection, particularly the Jesuit relations, has been interesting to read, because LaSalle didn't get along with the Jesuits at all. In fact, they avoided each other in New France at all costs. And there's a lot of good contextual information if you read this type of material. So I've ended up collecting a pretty large collection of material on the early period on the Great Lakes. including maps. I have a number of early 16 and 1700s French maps of the Great Lakes and charts. And of course, I also collect a lot of early lake survey charts and harbor survey charts, because they're very useful for understanding where the shipping lanes were at a given time, and what mariners of the day would have known from looking at their own maps. So I have a number of early lake survey charts, harbor charts, and coast pilot books that have been very helpful to me for doing that research. And then, of course, other serious major aspects of the collection are the photos, the ephemera that I have. I have a lot of stereopticon slides, maybe about 500 of them from the period 1860 to 1890, all showing Great Lakes vessels. Some of them are one of a kind. And I've collected those for about 20 years. And then also a lot of early woodcut engravings of shipwrecks. Really, after about 2010, I quit buying modern books, and I started buying only rare antiquarian books about Great Lakes history. And I started at that time to do appraisals for people. And so I still do that. I do it, as a subject matter expert. You can do that in Wisconsin. We don't have a licensure for personal property appraisal, only for real estate appraisal. I usually, if I'm appraising something that's worth over $5,000, I'll work under the license of a professional appraiser. But for collections under $5,000, I'm willing to do appraisals for people, and I do. I've done several of them. I helped to appraise the Peter Vanderlinden collection with Pat Labadie years ago.
Wow.
I appraised the Pete Caesar collection for donation to the Michigan Maritime Museum. I also appraised a large collection of whaleback material for donation to the Jim Dan Hall Library at Superior. And I still have, and I've done a couple others in recent years. I appraised the Schwartz Brothers collection up at Two Rivers. So that's something that I do. I'm pretty well acquainted with the value of Great Lakes antiquities and ephemera. And also having the background in restoration helps me with that as well. So my collection now fills about 30 shelves. It takes up about half my house. I think about 5,000 books, maybe more. I lost track. I do have it in an inventory, but I don't count them. I have about 1,000 maps and charts. Like I said, about 500 stereos, a couple hundred woodcut engravings, and a lot of ephemera, a lot of one-of-a-kind stuff. So I don't just collect stuff because it's out there. I collect things that are valuable. I really do it with an eye to value. Something, if I think something is going to appreciate in value, I'll buy it. And I usually don't buy it at full price. So I'm always looking, and I'm building relationships with antique dealers and with rare book collectors and auctioneers, things like that.
You're like those guys on Pawn Shop, aren't you?
Yeah, well, you really have to get to know people, that's a big part of it. And so that's how I managed to do that. And I show here my AGLMH award for historic interpretation. I won that for my work on the Griffon, for my translations of Lassalle's documents. They had been published in French by Margry, but they had never been translated to English. And so I translated those for the first time. And there's a lot in there that I have never shared. Interesting contextual information. Like Lassalle talks in detail about what's required to navigate the Great Lakes and a lot of the challenges he experienced trying to navigate the lakes. That information has never been translated to English. And so there are a number of pieces that I'd like to continue to translate, because it's actually an 80-page letter.
Oh, yeah.
I'd really like to finish up the whole thing someday.
Brendon, you brought up AGLMH. Can you talk about that group and what that's done for you to help you with this, especially getting to understand museums and stuff like that as well? What has that group done for you?
Well, so AGLMH, Association for Great Lakes Maritime History, is an umbrella organization composed of, I think, it's over 100 different maritime museums and historical societies around the Great Lakes. And all of the other groups that have been involved with historically are members, institutional members: WUAA, Wisconsin Maritime Museum, Wisconsin Marine Historical Society. Um, I became involved in AGLMH at the suggestion of Pat Labadie, who really is one of my mentors. And I got to know all the other really serious historians on the Great Lakes, people that were really digging in like I was. And it was an amazing experience because I thought I was the only one doing that kind of research. And I got to meet just some amazing people. I got to know Walt Lewis. I got to know Bill Lafferty. I got to know a fellow who's passed away who was very helpful to me, Bill McNeil from Toronto, Ontario, a wonderful man who shared with me very selflessly. And I started to get involved and do projects. I did a project with AGLMH to locate all of the existing copies of the ship registers of the Board of Lake Underwriters and the Inland Lloyds. These are really early. They predate the lists of U.S. merchant vessels. They go back to 1860. And they're some of the earliest and most important places to find out about early Great Lakes schooners and steamers. And nobody had more than a few of these, right?
Mm-hmm.
And I went out and found examples of all the extant copies in public and private collections. And a lot of them were only in private hands. And actually, I owned 3 of them that no one else had. And so that was my poker chip for to play at the table, so to speak. You want these, you give me some of yours. And I pulled together all sorts of maritime museums and institutions. And guess what? We built a full set of them. And every institution that participated got a full set of the registers of the Board of Lake Underwriters and the Inland Lloyds, which run from 1860 to 1907. And so, we copied each other's. Very important project. So Aglama, continues to be really important to me. One of the projects I have underway there now is digitizing all the wreck reports from the customs houses on the Great Lakes. Now, many people are familiar with life-saving service wreck reports, right, from the U.S. Life-Saving Service, but that's only reports where the life-saving service was called. So it's got to be a wreck that happened near a port. The customs house wreck reports are different. Every ship that had an accident on the Great Lakes had to file a customs house wreck report, but nobody can access them. They're all in these big leather-bound binders at the National Archives. And so I went to the National Archives in Chicago with Bob Jake and Jim Jarecki, and we went through them and enumerated them all. And we found out there are almost 7,000 wreck reports in the Great Lakes customs houses from the 1800s. And we got an agreement with the National Archives to allow us to digitize them. And of course, it was all put on hold due to the plague.
Yeah.
But we'll be going down there and making a database out of them and scanning them all, similar to what they did with the Mackinac manifests. And you'll be able to search that, and you'll be able to find all these wreck reports. And when I was going through them, I tell you, I saw many wreck reports for ships that I had no idea that they had been lost in a shipwreck. It's a completely untapped source. When I was there, they told me that many of those ledgers had not been looked at ever by a human being in modern history. Others hadn't been checked out since the 1970s. 2 of them had been stolen and were missing. So
that's crazy.
Yeah.
As we look at this list too, Brendon, of organizations, so many of the people who watch this show, you would be fantastic members for any of these, but I would do a specific pitch for the Association of Great Lakes Maritime History. You don't have to be a museum docent or a museum, director. They're looking for people even as lowly as me to help to share, not only stories and ideas, but to help with projects. Please think about becoming a member for any of these groups. It's been tough pickings for these groups to try to find new people, and they're looking for people like yourselves that are watching. If you're this interested to watch a show, you would definitely be a fantastic member for any of this.
Yeah, and I served on the boards of every one of these organizations at one time or another, and they're all excellent organizations. I particularly, Aglama obviously is a special place in my heart. But I also am very active to this day with the Wisconsin Underwater Archaeology Association and the Wisconsin Maritime Museum. And so I think it's very important to participate, in your local maritime history group. It's a good way to meet people. and to, like I did, build a knowledge base. I would have never been involved, would have learned what I did about ships had it not been for my involvement with the Wisconsin Marine Historical Society and helping to transcribe the Rungey cards. And Aglama certainly introduced me to people from across the Great Lakes, because every year in September, Aglama has its conference at a different museum somewhere on the Great Lakes, and you get to really travel around and meet all sorts of people. So very important.
That's awesome. We've got about 5 minutes left. What else did you want to cover in the 5 minutes that we have, my brother?
Well, we can run a little long. So one of the things that I've been doing a lot of now is wreck hunting. And many of you will know some of these people in this picture. This is from 2004. It's my dad on the left. He's no longer with us. Randy Beebe, Steve Radovan, who's still active wreck hunter, and my good friend Harry Zeich, who died a few years ago. Rick and I both knew him and missed him. This was an interesting weekend. We went and looked for the Mendota Dredge, which was used to dredge the Mendota Canal that connects Lac La Belle on the Keweenaw Peninsula with Lake Superior. And this dredge was lost in 1865, right at the end of the Civil War, when it sank off of Rabbit Island. And we went out searching with Harry, and Steve had always been interested in the Mendota Dredge too, so we all went together. It was an interesting group. Randy and I were the young guys, so we were stuck pulling cable on Harry's big Klein towfish, and as luck would have it, we bounced it off an underwater cliff and ripped the tail fins off. And Harry was having a tough week. He had just lost his son that week, and he'd actually come up to kind of put his mind off of it, because he was going through a tough time. And so we were all kind of there to support Harry, and we didn't find the dredge. Harry, he always had his own ideas, about where things were, and he completely moved the grid. We haven't been back up to search, but there are rumors that it may have been found. But yeah, we had a wonderful time that weekend. It's a great group of guys. I still am friends with everyone there who's, and obviously my dad and Harry are no longer with us. Here's a picture from, I think Bob Jake took this. That's Jerry Eliason and Craig Smith. Bob and I were up scanning wrecks up in Eagle Harbor and Copper Harbor, just doing some archaeological survey with my deep vision little eye, and all of a sudden we run into this sea dory, and I'm like, hey, I know that boat. And it was Craig and Jerry. They had just found the wreck of the Hudson that day. And it was amazing to come and talk with them. I'd been looking for the Hudson for years. Harry and I had a big project to do it. And then, of course, Harry passed away. And so it was amazing just to run into those guys at Eagle Harbor and have a couple of beers with them, And we've been friends for many years. And we didn't even know they were up there. Of course, that's my deep vision little eye. That's me with Towfish Envy. That's the David Boyd from the Great Lakes Shipwreck Historical Society behind me with their big marine sonics. That's my little deep vision little eye. I run it off my little fishing boat. You can run that out of a canoe if you want. It runs right off of the USB on your laptop.
Wow.
But very high resolution. It gives you some beautiful scans. This is Eagle Harbor. The left side there is the John L. Gross. The little strip up on the right is the Traveler, the sidewheel steamer, and then down off the dock in the lower right is the yacht Napa Knee that burned. And then, of course, you can see what it'll do on that isn't even maximum range, but look at you can see the resolution. I'm seeing every single stick on the bottom of Eagle Harbor. It's really impressive what that thing will do. Jim Kennard sold it to me. It's a deep vision little eye made in Sweden. So I still go out, I still look with that. But it's only got about 430 feet per channel. It's a short range, archaeological scanner. So Bob and I finally broke down and took the plunge. The other guys haven't. Bought ourselves a Garmin 94 SV. We each bought one actually, and Bob made these two towfish based on a design from Randy Beebe with this really interesting tubular tail fin, which works really well. We fixed it with, at 60 feet of dog cable. We bought the 30-foot extender, so we have 60 feet of cable. And it flies pretty deep. We've got a lead nose cone in it, and we can get down below the thermocline with it and find shipwrecks. So Bob and I have been going out together pretty much exclusively looking for wrecks. We got a bunch of targets. that we go out and look for pretty regularly. And this is Bob and I on the outside of Porter's Island at Copper Harbor. We had been looking for or not looking for, we've been surveying the Wasaga that lies there broken on the bottom. So Bob and I are looking forward to another big season of wreck hunting and having a lot of fun. We've got a number of WUAA projects we'll be doing. We're going to finish our survey of the Milwaukee canals in the Menominee Valley. We're going to do the Burnham Canal here in a little while. And we've got a survey that we're doing on the inland survey off of Aztalan, the ancient Cahokian Native American site. We're going to be surveying the river there and seeing if there are any fish weirs on the bottom with the sonar. So a lot of stuff going on.
That's awesome.
Yeah. So that is about it, Rick. Let me see if I can bring the thing back up and turn things back over to you.
Well, I sure appreciate you spending time talking about you. I know that it's neat to learn from other people, but I know a lot of us have been waiting to hear your story and to hear, why you got into it and how you share it. I saw one of the comments that just popped up about how we do all need to kind of get together and share this information before we all pass away. And it's always been, I think, the mantra of people before us in many cases to keep the information and die with the numbers. I hope that that's not where we're at now. I think that, now we've got a better ethic about sharing and quite frankly, what good is it if it's gone? So my hope is that won't happen. And I appreciate them writing in. But do you have time to do an afterglow afterwards? Are you going to invite people to maybe sit and chat afterwards as well?
I think so. I think we should do a Zoom room, don't you, Rick?
I do too. I think it'd be fun to see folks. And I'm just getting Facebook user. I don't see actual names on this, so it'd be nice to see who's here and to say hello.
I don't either.
Yeah.
I don't either, Rick. It's a bug. You have to have everybody do some sort of special sign in, and I just haven't bothered with it. But
yeah, well, it'd be good to see everybody in person, especially on April Fool's Day.
Definitely. Well, Rick, thanks so much for doing this and helping out. I do appreciate you being our guest host tonight. And
my absolute pleasure to do it, and I'm glad people bared with me today because the regular host will be back as regularly scheduled.
Well, and of course, if you haven't figured it out yet, I didn't have a guest for this week, and it was April Fool's. I thought, what fun we could have Mixter come on, and everybody would be confused as hell.
I think it's great, and then have Griffon and your insight into the Griffon. I think we held up at least to offer something new, and hopefully you'll have a Griffon show and do stuff based on shows too, maybe in the future. Based on wrecks that would be neat to have multiple, people to talk about it.
Yeah, definitely. And I do have a lot more on the Griffon. I wouldn't mind talking more about her. I do a full-length presentation on her, but I get kind of burned out on it. I've been more interested in other things lately. So anyway, I'd like to thank everybody for joining. Thank you, Rick, so much for doing this. Thank you, everybody, who posted questions. I do have a couple of housekeeping things. Next week, we have a guest, Chris Winters. For those of you who know Wisconsin shipwreck stuff or Discovery World Museum or the Dennis Sullivan or the work he's done.
His Fitz book is amazing.
Documenting ships. He is an amazing fellow, and I've known Chris for many years, and I'm so happy that he agreed to be on the show. He's going to be on next week. So you don't want to miss Chris Winters. And I also want to thank everybody. I did a couple of posts this week asking for people, hey, keep the posts on topic. You know what happens, right? If you post something that's kind of loosely related, pretty soon 10 people immediately follow, and the next thing you know, it's the Great Lakes group.
And there's plenty of those. Yeah, there's definitely
research group. So thanks everybody, and I apologize if I'm seeming to be heavy-handed, but it's the way we keep our channel healthy and lively. So thanks so much for bearing with me. Well, everybody, stay tuned. I'll be posting the Zoom room, and I will see you there.
Good night,
everybody.